February 12, 1943. Rabaul Air Base, New Britain. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his palm against the chain-link fence, fingers curling through the wire mesh as he watched the American prisoner being loaded onto a stretcher. The man's flight suit was torn at the shoulder, dark with blood that looked black in the afternoon sun. What struck Yamamoto wasn't the wound itself. He'd seen worse, inflicted worse, but the speed. 2 American medics had materialized within minutes of the crash landing, moving with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. No shouting, no confusion, just swift, practiced efficiency. The prisoner's face was pale, lips moving soundlessly. Morphine, probably. Yamamoto had heard the Americans were generous with it. He turned away, catching fragments of conversation from the other Japanese pilots clustered near the command post. They were laughing. Someone had sketched a crude caricature in the dirt, an airplane with wings bent upward like a gull in flight, or a drunkard stumbling home. The F4U Corsair, whistling death, the Americans called it, though the nickname struck Yamamoto as typically American. Dramatic, self-aggrandizing, the kind of thing you'd see in their propaganda films. "Look at those wings," Lieutenant Saito said, gesturing toward the captured technical drawings pinned to the bulletin board. "Inverted gull design. Do you know how many engineering problems that creates? The Americans are so obsessed with speed, they've built a plane that can barely take off from their own carriers." More laughter. Yamamoto wanted to join in, but something held him back. A tightness in his chest that felt like intuition, or fear masquerading as prudence. The sketch in the dirt showed a Corsair spinning out of control, its peculiar wings twisted like broken bird bones. He'd seen that image become reality 3 times in the past month. What he hadn't seen was a single Corsair shot down by his own squadron. The intelligence briefings had been clear, almost dismissive. The Vault F4U Corsair represented American industrial hubris at its finest. A massively powerful Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower, mated to an airframe designed by engineers who prioritize straight-line speed over battlefield practicality. The inverted gull wing configuration, while aerodynamically sound in theory, created a nightmare of visibility problems for carrier landings. The long nose blocked the pilot's forward view during approach. The aircraft bounced on touchdown, earning it the nickname Ensign Eliminator among American naval aviators. Japanese intelligence had documented these flaws with satisfaction. The Zero, lighter, more maneuverable, with superior visibility, remained the dominant fighter in the Pacific theater. American pilots were brave, certainly, but bravery couldn't compensate for an inferior machine. Commander Nakamura had said as much during the briefing. The Corsair is fast in a straight line, but combat isn't a race, it's a dance, and the Zero, he'd smiled, knows all the steps. Yamamoto had believed him. They all had. The first encounter came on a clear morning in late February, the kind of day where the ocean looked like hammered metal and the sky stretched forever. Yamamoto's squadron, 8 Zeros in tight formation, was escorting bombers toward Allied positions on Guadalcanal when the radio crackled to life. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." Yamamoto's eyes found them immediately. 4 contacts, diving from 25,000 feet. Their silhouettes unmistakable, even at distance. Those bent wings. They looked wrong, unnatural, like something a child might draw who'd never seen an airplane before. "Break right," Commander Nakamura's voice, sharp with command. "Standard engagement pattern. Use your maneuverability. Don't try to outrun them." The Zero banked hard, and Yamamoto felt the familiar G-force pressing him into his seat. This was where the Zero excelled. Tight turns, quick reversals, the kind of knife-fight maneuvering that American planes, with their heavier airframes, simply couldn't match. The first Corsair passed overhead, and Yamamoto got his first real look at it. Massive. The engine cowling seemed to occupy half the aircraft's length. The propeller was enormous, 13 feet in diameter, he'd read, requiring that bizarre, inverted gull wing just to provide ground clearance. Everything about it screamed excess, American over-engineering. He rolled into position behind the second Corsair, lining up his shot. The angle was perfect. His thumb moved toward the firing button. Then the Corsair accelerated, not gradually, not with the labored increase of speed you'd expect from a machine already pushing its limits. It simply left, as if someone had cut the strings, holding it to the sky, and gravity had reversed direction. One moment, it was in his gun sight. The next, it was a shrinking dot 500 yards ahead. 400 miles per hour. That was the intelligence estimate for the Corsair's maximum speed. But this was something else entirely. "Stay with him," Nakamura shouted. "Don't let them separate us." But separation was already happening. The Corsairs weren't dogfighting. They were making high-speed passes, diving through the formation with their 650 caliber machine guns, raking the sky with tracer fire, then climbing back to altitude before the Zeros could respond. Boom and zoom, the Americans called it. Yamamoto would learn the term later from a captured pilot, but in that moment, he only understood it as helplessness. Lieutenant Saito's Zero came apart in mid-air, the wing shearing off in a burst of orange flame. Yamamoto never saw what hit him. 2 more Zeros fell in the next 90 seconds. The Corsairs vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, climbing to 30,000 feet, where the Zeros, with their non-turbocharged engines, couldn't follow. Yamamoto's hands were shaking on the control stick. Not from fear, not yet, but from the cognitive dissonance of watching everything he'd been taught about air combat become obsolete in the span of a single engagement. They'd lost 3 aircraft, shot down 0. The mathematics of that ratio would haunt him for months. The Americans called it the slot, the narrow channel through the Solomon Islands where Japanese and Allied forces clashed daily in battles that felt less like warfare and more like mutual annihilation. Yamamoto had flown 47 missions since that first encounter with the Corsairs. He'd stopped counting victories after the 20th. Not from humility, but because victories had stopped mattering. What mattered was survival. The Corsairs were everywhere now. Marine Fighter Squadron 214, VMF 215, VMF 124. The Americans rotated fresh squadrons through Guadalcanal every few weeks, each one flying the bent-wing Devils with a proficiency that suggested they'd been training with them for years rather than months. The technical problems that had plagued the Corsairs' carrier operations, the visibility issues, the landing bounce, meant nothing to the Marines operating from land bases. They'd taken the Navy's reject and turned it into the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. The statistics told the story. In March, Corsair squadrons had claimed an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. 11-to-1. Yamamoto had seen the intelligence reports, watched the numbers climb with each passing week. Some pilots dismissed it as American exaggeration, propaganda inflating modest successes into mythical dominance. Yamamoto had stopped believing that after his wingman, Ensign Fukuda, 22 years old, engaged to a girl in Hiroshima, had been blown out of the sky by a Corsair he never saw coming. The American had dove from cloud cover, fired a 2-second burst that turned Fukuda's Zero into confetti, and was gone before Yamamoto could even turn his head. 2 seconds. That's all it took. The Corsair mounted 6 M2 Browning machine guns, 3 per wing, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. In a 2-second burst, a Corsair put nearly 300 rounds into the air, half-inch bullets traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The Zero's lightweight construction, the same design philosophy that made it so maneuverable, meant it had virtually no armor. A single burst could saw a wing off. 2 bursts could reduce the entire aircraft to falling debris. Yamamoto had learned to recognize the sound of those guns, not the individual reports. At that rate of fire, they blended into a continuous roar, like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. He'd learned to recognize it from inside his cockpit, over the engine noise and wind, which meant the bullets were close enough to kill him. He'd heard it 17 times. He was still alive through a combination of skill, instinct, and probability that couldn't hold forever. The morning briefing was shorter than usual. Commander Nakamura looked older, his face carrying the weight of losses that no amount of Bushido rhetoric could offset. 60 pilots had been stationed at Rabaul in January. 31 remained. The rest were dead, missing, or so badly wounded they'd been shipped back to Japan. Intelligence indicates a major American supply convoy approaching Guadalcanal, Nakamura said, his voice flat. 12 bombers will strike at 0800. Our squadron will provide escort. No one asked about enemy fighter presence. Everyone knew the answer. Yamamoto checked his aircraft with the ritualistic precision of a man who'd stopped believing in divine protection and started believing in maintenance. Oil level, ammunition, control surfaces. The Zero was still a beautiful machine, elegant where the Corsair was brutish, refined where the American fighter was raw power wrapped in metal. But beauty didn't stop bullets. They took off in formation, climbing through scattered clouds toward the morning sun. The ocean below was calm, almost serene. Deceptive, like everything else in this war. The radio crackled. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, multiple contacts. Yamamoto's stomach tightened. Not fear, he'd moved past fear weeks ago, but resignation. The same choreography, the same ending. 8 Corsairs, diving from altitude. What happened next occurred too fast for conscious thought. Training took over, muscle memory bypassing the brain's slower, analytical processes. Yamamoto broke left as tracers stitched the sky where he'd been. Someone was screaming on the radio. Someone was always screaming. A Corsair flashed past, close enough that Yamamoto could see the pilot's face. Young, younger than Fukuda had been, expression hidden behind an oxygen mask. Then it was gone, pulling up in a climb that defied physics. Yamamoto tried to follow, pulling back on the stick, feeling the airframe shudder as it approached its structural limits. The Corsair kept climbing, effortlessly, like gravity was optional. He leveled off at 20,000 feet, lungs burning, vision tunneling from oxygen deprivation. Below, the battle had devolved into chaos. 2 Zeros were burning. The bombers had scattered. The Corsairs moved through the sky like sharks through a school of fish, methodical, unhurried, utterly dominant. Then the engine coughed. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no smoke. Just a hesitation in the rhythm. A stumble that sent ice through Yamamoto's veins. He checked the gauges. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. A lucky hit. Or an unlucky one, depending on perspective. The engine coughed again, more violently. Black smoke began trailing from the cowling. Yamamoto's hand moved to the canopy release, but something stopped him. Not heroism, not defiance. Simple, stubborn refusal to die in the water where sharks would find him before rescue could. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for distance, nursing the dying engine toward the coastline. 5 miles. 3. The engine seized completely at 1,000 feet, the propeller windmilling uselessly. He had one chance at this. The crash landing was textbook perfect, considering the circumstances. Wheels up, nose high, bleeding off speed in the seconds before impact. The Zero hit the beach hard enough to crack ribs, skidding through sand and scrub before coming to rest 50 yards from the tree line. Yamamoto sat in the cockpit, breathing hard, tasting blood. His left arm wasn't working properly, dislocated shoulder probably, or broken collarbone. The pain would come later, when the adrenaline wore off. For now, there was only the need to move, to get away from the aircraft before the explosion came from behind, a rolling wall of heat that lifted him off his feet and deposited him face down in the sand. His ears were ringing, his vision was blurred. He tried to stand, managed to get to his knees before his legs gave out. That's when he heard the voices. English, American. 2 Marines approached, weapons raised, movements cautious, but not hostile. One of them was speaking, but Yamamoto couldn't understand the words. Everything sounded underwater, distant and distorted. He thought about the pistol on his hip, thought about the cultural expectations of honorable death, the shame of capture, all the narratives he'd absorbed since childhood. Then he thought about Fukuda, about the 30 other pilots who weren't coming home, about the mathematics of a war that traded 11 lives for 1. He left the pistol holstered. One of the Marines knelt beside him, hands moving with surprising gentleness as they checked for wounds. When those hands found the shoulder, Yamamoto couldn't suppress a gasp. The pain had arrived. "Corpsman," the Marine shouted, and suddenly there were more people, more hands, a stretcher materializing from nowhere. Someone was cutting away his flight suit. Someone else was pressing something cold against his skin. An IV needle, he realized distantly, fluid flowing into his veins. Morphine. They were giving him morphine. The absurdity of it cut through the haze. He was a prisoner, an enemy combatant who'd been trying to kill these men hours ago, and they were treating him with a drug they could barely spare for their own wounded. The last thing he remembered before unconsciousness claimed him was being lifted onto the stretcher, watching the sky spin overhead, hearing one of the Marines say, "Get him to surgery. That shoulder needs immediate attention." Immediate attention. Not after the Americans were treated. Not if supplies permitted. Immediate. The cognitive dissonance of it followed him into darkness. Yamamoto woke to white walls and the smell of disinfectant. His left arm was immobilized, strapped across his chest. The pain in his shoulder had dulled to a manageable throb. He tried to sit up, but dizziness forced him back down. A voice spoke in broken Japanese. "Easy. Surgery yesterday. Shoulder fixed." Yamamoto turned his head. An American doctor, Navy, judging by the insignia, stood beside the bed, checking a clipboard. Behind him, through an open doorway, Yamamoto could see a long corridor lined with beds. Dozens of them, most occupied by men in American uniforms, but some Japanese uniforms. He was in a ward with other prisoners. The doctor followed his gaze. "Yes," he said, still in that halting Japanese. "We treat everyone. You understand? Everyone." Yamamoto did understand, and that was the problem. The cognitive framework he'd built over months of combat, years of cultural conditioning, was crumbling. He'd been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, that their material wealth masked moral weakness, that they valued comfort over honor, life over duty. But a soft people didn't build the Corsair. A decadent people didn't develop the logistics to put 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel on a contested island and keep it supplied week after week. A weak people didn't take prisoners from the nation that had killed their brothers and friends, then operate on those prisoners immediately with the same level of care they'd provide their own wounded. The surgery, Yamamoto managed in English, surprising himself. Why so fast? The doctor looked puzzled. Why? Because you needed it. The shoulder was badly dislocated, bone fragments pressing on nerves. Another few hours, you might have lost function permanently. He paused, then added with a slight smile, "We're doctors. We fix people. That's the job. That's the job. Not propaganda. Not a calculated display for psychological warfare purposes. Just a simple statement of professional obligation, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use to describe changing a tire or filing a report." Over the next 3 weeks, as his shoulder healed and physical therapy began, Yamamoto had time to observe. The American medical staff treated Japanese prisoners with the same efficiency they applied to everything else. No cruelty, no particular kindness, just systematic competence. 3 meals daily, portions that would have been generous even for American soldiers. Medical supplies used without hesitation. A dentist who fixed a cracked molar Yamamoto had been living with for 6 months. But it was the small things that undid him. The Marine Guard, who seeing Yamamoto struggling to eat left-handed, wordlessly cut his food into manageable pieces. The nurse who, noticing his discomfort during hot nights, brought an extra fan. The physical therapist who worked with him daily, pushing him through exercises with a combination of encouragement and professional firmness that reminded Yamamoto of his own instructors back in Japan. They weren't trying to humiliate him. They weren't trying to convert him. They were simply doing their jobs with a level of systematic efficiency that made Japanese propaganda about American weakness look increasingly absurd. One afternoon, while sitting in the recovery ward, Yamamoto watched through a window as a Corsair landed on the airstrip. The approach was textbook. Gear down, flaps extended, that long nose pointing skyward to give the pilot visibility. It bounced once on touchdown, the oleo struts compressing and extending, but the pilot corrected smoothly and taxied to the apron. The bent-wing devil. The plane they'd laughed at. Yamamoto thought about the intelligence reports, the dismissive assessments, the cultural certainty that had blinded them to reality. The Corsair wasn't elegant. It wasn't refined. It was a hammer wrapped in aluminum. 2,000 horsepower, driving 13 feet of propeller, 6 machine guns that could saw through aircraft like scissors through paper. It was effective, and in war, effectiveness was the only metric that mattered. The kill ratios told the story. By May of 1943, Corsairs had achieved a documented 11-to-1 advantage over Japanese fighters. By the war's end, that ratio would climb to 11.3 to 1. 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 189 Corsairs in combat. 11 to 1. Yamamoto had survived the mathematics by the narrowest of margins and only by becoming a prisoner. The news reached the camp in fragments, rumors that seemed too apocalyptic to be true. A single bomb. An entire city. Then another. Hiroshima. Nagasaki. Yamamoto stood in the compound yard, listening to the other prisoners process the information in their own ways. Some wept, some retreated into angry denial. Some simply sat in stunned silence. He thought about Ensign Fukuda's fiancée in Hiroshima, wondered if she'd survived, though the statistics suggested otherwise. 70,000 dead in the initial blast, another 70,000 in the months that followed. The war ended 6 days later. They were released in September, loaded onto transport ships for the journey home. Yamamoto stood at the rail as Guam receded into the distance, watching the island shrink to a green dot on an endless blue canvas. Somewhere on that island, in a medical facility he'd never see again, were the people who'd saved his life and treated him with more dignity than he'd believed possible from an enemy. The cognitive dissonance had never fully resolved. His shoulder, fully functional now thanks to that immediate surgery, ached slightly in the sea breeze. A permanent reminder of the day his understanding of the world had been forcibly recalibrated. March 1978. Aviation Museum, Tokyo. Takeshi Yamamoto, now 57 years old, stood before the exhibit with his grandson. The boy was 12, aviation-obsessed, full of questions about the war that Yamamoto usually deflected with platitudes and generalizations. But today, looking at the restored F4U Corsair suspended from the ceiling, that distinctive inverted gull wing, the massive radial engine, the scars of combat carefully preserved, he felt compelled toward honesty. "We laughed at it," he said quietly. "When we first saw the intelligence photographs, we thought it looked ridiculous. Those bent wings, the landing problems. We thought the Americans had built a plane they couldn't even use properly." His grandson looked up, curious. "But they did use it." "Yes." Yamamoto's hand unconsciously moved to his left shoulder, to the surgical scar hidden beneath his shirt. "They used it very well. Do you know what the kill ratio was? 11-1. For every Corsair lost, 11 of our aircraft were destroyed." The boy absorbed this with the easy acceptance of someone who'd grown up in peacetime, for whom war was history rather than memory. "Why did we lose so badly, grandfather?" It was the question Yamamoto had spent 33 years trying to answer. Not just about the Corsair, but about everything: the logistics, the industrial capacity, the systematic approach to warfare that had ground Japanese forces into dust despite their courage and skill. "We mistook efficiency for softness," he said finally. "We thought that because the Americans valued comfort and life, they would be weak. But efficiency isn't weakness. It's just efficiency. When you can produce 50,000 Corsairs in 4 years, when you can fly the wounded to surgery within minutes, when you train pilots so thoroughly that they turn a troubled fighter design into the most effective aircraft in the theater." He trailed off, searching for words. "It means they were better prepared? It means they understood something we didn't. That war isn't about who's willing to die. It's about who's able to keep their people alive while accomplishing the mission." He paused, looking up at the Corsair. That plane saved as many American lives as it took Japanese ones, not because it was beautiful or honorable or elegant, but because it worked. They stood in silence for a long moment, grandfather and grandson, separated by half a lifetime and an entire world of experience. Outside, Tokyo thrummed with the energy of reconstruction and reinvention, a city that had learned its own hard lessons about underestimating opponents. Yamamoto thought about the doctor at Guadalcanal. "We're doctors. We fix people. That's the job. Simple competence, systematic efficiency. The quiet determination to do the job well, whether that job was fixing a dislocated shoulder or building a fighter plane that could dominate the Pacific theater." They'd laughed at the Corsair, and the Corsair had replied with 11-1 kill ratios and a systematic dismantling of Japanese air power that left no room for argument. Sometimes, Yamamoto reflected, the most devastating response to mockery is simply to be effective. The bent-winged devil hung above them, silent and eternal, its guns empty, but its message clear. Never confuse aesthetics with capability. Never mistake different approaches for inferior ones, and never, ever underestimate an opponent who treats efficiency as its own form of honor. His grandson tugged at his sleeve. "Can we see the zero next?" Yamamoto smiled, the expression carrying 3 decades of hard-earned wisdom. Of course, it was a beautiful aircraft. The pilots who flew it were brave and skilled. But the Corsair was better. A complex question, deserving of a complex answer. But sometimes, truth could be simple. "Yes," Yamamoto said, "the Corsair was better." They moved to the next exhibit, and the bent-winged devil watched them go, its story told in metal and memory, a reminder that history belongs not to those who laugh loudest, but to those who work hardest and learn fastest. The mathematics had been clear from the beginning, 11-1. Some lessons Yamamoto had learned can only be taught through defeat.